I decided to talk to you about SOE, okay? Special Operations Sector. It's a very tight group. I'm particularly interested in it because I love building equipment. And in the SOE, they were using suitcase-type portable communications equipment. Now, up until about 5 years ago, getting information about the circuitry and what went on with the equipment, hard to come by. Not impossible, but difficult. I started developing a library, and in this bibliography at the end, you will see a listing of 2 texts. Now, these are my favorites, they're the most informative, and if you're at all interested in the subject, look for them if you would. They're still in print, both of them. This is The Secret Wireless War, and when I bought it, it was sealed. I bought it at a Hamfest. It was sealed, and I thought, well, by golly, I'll be able to get some schematics. No. Lots of pictures, very interesting. It's a description, if you will, of MI6. MI6 was the branch of the Secret Service that was involved with overseas activities. It might be a embassy, as an example. It could be an agent. MI5, on the other hand, was internal, within Britain itself, or its, I guess, did it include the other areas of the British Empire? MI5, they wouldn't be, that'd be MI6, wouldn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
Think of MI5 as the FBI and MI6 as the CIA.
Great, I hadn't heard that. That's a perfect way to put it. You all understand that? Did you hear that? Okay. Well, as the war was, the clouds of war were developing, the Germans were very active in developing clandestine equipment. The British, not so much. The Germans had a heck of a head start. Just before the war would be ready to start, most of their equipment that's available, the receivers were super heterodyne. When the British finally got involved, what were they using? Regenerative receivers. Now, can you imagine trying to tune a regenerative receiver with a band of frequencies full of signals, whether they be real signals, jamming, whatever? I'm having trouble. Can you get me some water? Thank you. Well, I lost my train of thought.
Superhit.
Huh?
Superhit and regenerative.
Yeah. So here were the Germans with their, I would call it for the time frame, rather sophisticated equipment. They were from Ukraine, the area of Ukraine, France, all of the Low Countries, excuse me, Britain, they were in Britain, and they were using their equipment. And the British were aware of them, they were monitoring them, but this was just prior to the war. The Secret Service, excuse me, I wrote it down, I'm always, the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, was that, thank you so much. I don't know why I'm
I don't have a drink out of it before you.
Well, that's all right. I can only die. The SIS was the government agency that was in charge of this monitoring. To go back a little bit, remember I mentioned to you that MI6 was involved with communicating with embassies and such. The equipment they were using, if you, those of you can see the picture of the Tinker Box. It's a wood frame box, about so big, and that's their transmitter. Consisted of a 6V6 driving an 807. Had about 25 watts output. That was the best they had, for heaven's sakes. That's kind of scary. My intent is to build one of these. I haven't got around to it yet, but just to have it. As far as equipment, if you were going to use it for spy purposes, forget it, they didn't have it. About the time the war started, there was a change going on within the British government, and SIS, which was the in power at the time, moved from Bletchley Park to Wadden Hall. Churchill wanted an element of the, quote, Secret Service that would go into occupied countries and create havoc. He had envisioned them, you know, they'd blow up a train or whatever, cause all kinds of problems. They were noisy. The Secret Service, on the other hand, at SIS, they were quiet. They'd go into a country and work quietly. When the SOE was, oh, thank you. When the SOE was founded, guess what? MI6, SIS, wasn't too happy. And then you think about what goes on today in politics, people fighting for control and so forth. That's what was going on. And if it wasn't for the fact that Churchill wanted SOE, I'm sure SOE would have been lost early on in the war. But he persisted. And he referred to them as his ultra group, as well as what was going on with the Enigma. Okay? Ultra was top secret. You know, SOE was going to put agents into the countries that were being occupied by the Germans. Specifically, he was interested in France, the Lower Belgium, Holland, Norway. The French, I guess, was probably the most upsetting, embarrassing operations of the war. There was a story, and it's been portrayed in film. If any of you have ever seen Foyle's War on PBS, did you ever watch Foyle's War? Okay. Well, there's 2 episodes over the period of, what, 5 or 6 years that the program was on. And one of them is in the final, it's the final program, it's called Elise. And it talks about the young girl who is dropped into France. And she doesn't last 3 days. The French underground that the SOE was trying to connect with and support had been infiltrated by the Germans quite successfully. So much so that they had got one of the first agents that had arrived, that captured, and they had this agent send back a message. Not a problem, because when he would send back the message, he would have a code to either head up the message or tail end the message, which would indicate it was from him. No code. Okay? He left it off purposely to warn them that he was in trouble. What did they do? Oh, he probably made a mistake. Ignore it. This went on and on. They'd send the next agent. Guess what? They nailed the second agent. The message would come back, lacking the code. Go ahead, go on. I mean, you think the British, I mean, we've got it bad. The British are just as nuts as we are, I mean, as far as following procedures. A total of 17 agents were lost. And it was a big embarrassment. Same happened with the Dutch. There was an episode where they were turning over a tinker box to the Dutch resistance, and at the meeting, the Dutch had been infiltrated, worse than the French. There was a shootout. The two British guys were captured. The Dutchman was shot, killed. The only country in all my reading, and the only country that seemed to do well with the supplied materials were the Norwegians. Their resistance, their underground, worked quite well. Now you might think, well, why in the world, with everything falling apart, would the SOE continue and be successful? Well, it wasn't really until D-Day. You know, remember I said SOE was to go in and raise havoc, raise hell, blow up things up, so forth. On the other hand, MI6, they were quiet. They were following diplomatic procedures. Okay, D-Day, what do they need? They need people. They need tracks blown up. They need infrastructure blown up. That's where SOE came into its own after D-Day. Okay. They were there at the end, and that's what they seemed to want to survive for. They knew they were having problems with the French system. They knew they had problems with the Dutch system, but they persisted. And the story goes that basically what it was is they wanted to be there at the end. When the war did end, all their records, everything was destroyed. Same with the Enigma. All that material that was developed by Turing and his group was all burned, destroyed. Even the bomb that you referenced, that they used in the film, they have a copy that still exists in the Imperial Museum. That had to be, in a sense, made after the fact, since all the original was gone. Well, SOE, I think it was a fascinating time. It was a group in a very fascinating time. I personally just get overwhelmed with the information. Now, I want to spend some time, just a few minutes, talking to you about probably the two most well-known pieces of clandestine equipment that was developed. This is the Olga, which was developed by the Norwegians. And the fascinating story about it was, when the Germans came into Norway and initiated their control, they immediately got a hold of every radio they could find. You know, stop and think about it. If you don't have a radio, you don't get information. So it helps to keep the population under control. The other thing was they were going to take those radios, refurbish them, send them back to Germany for the Germans to use. So they collect all these radios. Now what are we going to do with them? Oh, here's this company, radio company in Norway, and we're going to turn them over to this company, and this company is going to refurbish them and send them on to Germany. Well, guess what this company does? They start taking parts, right? Collecting parts. We're going to build our own transmitter and receiver. Well, they had a great idea. Rather than these guys here being the ones that we're going to build the equipment, no? These two guys they're going to build a certain section of the receiver, maybe the RF section, the oscillator. These guys are going to have the audio section. The transmitter, these guys are gonna have the oscillator. This guy's gonna have the amplifier, the final stage. The reason being is that if these guys get caught, by the way, they didn't know any of these other fellows. So the problem would be cut off right there. It was only at the end when all 4 parts or 5 parts or whatever it might have been came together that that group had everything. So they were, of course, the most vulnerable. But the thing about this unit, the design of it, this is a super heterodyne receiver. Very sensitive and reasonably selective for the time frame. If you might be interested in learning more about it, or even building one yourself, on your page, on your list, look up Gray-Green Radio. It's an Italian who's got a site that's fabulous. He describes both the Olga and the Paraset. And it's so popular, most of the people that have gone to that site have ended up wanting to build the Paraset because it's so simple. And if you're interested in doing that, you can find the information there on the site. I got all my information for the Olga on that site. When I build a piece, I build it not just for display, I want to use it. If I can't get the thing to work, put it on the air, why have it? And this thing puts out about 15 watts. Like I said, the receiver's pretty sensitive, reasonably selective, and stable. It's a nice little unit. The Paraset, on the other hand, is a regenerative type receiver. It's miserable to tune. Even on today's bands with no jamming, well, I guess you could say no jamming. There's jamming. But what most hams did is we went into the tuning section, and this thing was designed to go from approximately 2.5 to 9 megahertz, okay, in a rotation of 180 degrees. That is a lot of frequency in a short physical space. So what we did is we modified that so that we're only covering the ham band, and specifically the CW portion of the ham band. What you end up with is a much more useful piece of equipment if you want to put it on the air. Now, it's still a stinker to tune because it's regenerative, but it does lend itself to being put on the air and being reasonably functional. Now, if you've never, how many of you build equipment in here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, you get out.
Very none.
Get out of here.
Very none.
Okay. You might say, well, gee whiz, that's not my cup of tea. The fact of the matter is, it really, if you're willing to do some reading and you're willing to do some work, it can be done reasonably well. When I start working on a piece, and I've been working on one now for 1.5 years, collecting parts. And the unit that I'm interested in happens to be on the front page of this book. And this book, if you want to get a book that's got schematics in it, this is the one you want. It's on your list. Wireless for the Warrior, Volume 4. Available in England. With shipping, it cost me about $90. But anybody wants to come up and look through it later, feel free to. It's broken up by country and what was developed by that country during the war years for clandestine radios with schematics. Now, the schematics aren't quite complete. Oftentimes, they'll have all the information for resistors and capacitors. They'll show the coil, no information on the coil. Or if they show information on the coil, it might just be the inductance. So many microhenries. Oh, okay. But there's a clue. In most of the material that's been written about this subject, they reference the fact that these circuits, in many cases, came out of the Radio Amateur Handbook and radio publications prior to World War II. Well, if that be the case, you start looking back in your old handbooks, and you find circuits almost identical. So you can punch in the numbers in terms of finding the component. I start out by a particular portion of the circuit to try to get it going. This and I use a Manhattan-style board. This happened to be the oscillator. I was trying to get the oscillator working. I didn't know what the inductance of the coil was. It didn't give the information. And it allows me to experiment to get the correct component values. You can just hand that around. Once I do that, then I can start looking at, okay, what's the darn thing supposed to look like? Now, in this particular unit, which is the Type 3 Mark II, you'll notice there's a little window up here, and that's where the readout is. But the tuning is down here. And it just, they had to have some kind of gearing. Well, I corresponded with the Imperial Museum in London, and they were so helpful. The guy drew me a picture, a hand-drawn picture of how they did it. And it was, in fact, a gear that had the frequency printed on the gear itself. So when you tune the gear, there's your frequency, being pretty obvious. Well, where in the heck am I going to get a gear like that, right? So you got to do a little thinking and a little imagination. Eventually, I was able to find a couple of gears in my junk box that worked, and I'll pass this around. You can see it. And it turns out with a reduction in there, reduction gear, I got a 4-to-1 tuning ratio. And for the dial, I'm using an old CD. Remember the little CDs? What did you call them? What were they called? Minis?
Discs.
Mini discs. And that's what I'm using. This is the receiver portion. It's finally finished. Works fine. Covers 80, 40, and 20 meters. The transmitter should be a no-brainer. I mean, it's just basic circuit stuff. You can pass this around if you want. I would encourage anybody who's got the slightest interest to take a shot at some of these projects. Remembering, it was hams back then that were helping with the war. Their written materials were being used, the ham radio journals, the handbook itself. That's where a lot of the circuits came from. When it came to monitoring German activity in Europe, who was doing the monitoring? Well, they had a system of Y stations. These were government run. There were about 37 of them, as best I can determine, spread all over the country. Was it about 37, Clive? I counted 37. But it was augmented by volunteer interceptors, VIs. Okay? Hams, over 1,000 of them. If you look on that list, I've got a site for you to go to where you can hear all about what they were doing. But again, hams were involved. And why were they chosen? Well, they were chosen because most of them could copy code. But also they could tune a receiver. They were familiar with the receiver. They could tune a transmitter. Many of them have built their own equipment. Unfortunately today, so many of us that get into ham radio, we operate a box. And every time I have an opportunity, I try to encourage people to take a shot at building something. And the easiest one to build, out of all the ones I've come up with, is the Paraset. All the instructions are on that site. If you know how to solder, and if you can read component values, you should be able to put one together. It'd be a lot of fun. And if you've got a license, how many of you copy code in here? Oh, good, great, super. A lot of guys get on all the time with the military groups and use that type of equipment. Let me stop and see if there's anybody got any questions. I've only put one person to sleep I know of.
Can you talk about the paraset unit?
What do you want to know?
What's involved? Can you tip it up and let's look at it?
I can tip it up, I can pass it around if you'd like.
Just tip it up and point out stuff.
I've got 9 minutes of film.
Ed wants to get a picture of it.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Let me get a close-up.
Real quick.
Here's your receiver portion, here's your transmitter portion over here. Crystal control. This one I've only got working on 80 and 40. I didn't bother with 20. The original would have given you that opportunity. Here's your key, built-in key. I use an external key primarily, but you can use the internal. It works quite well. Tuning is straightforward. Here's your receiving tuning. The only part that's hard to come by is this knob right here, and it's critical. You'll notice down here there's a little vernier portion, and I made this using a couple of washers. Again, the instructions you'll find on your sheet to make what I've done here. About a year ago, a friend of mine called, he said, look on eBay, there's new in the box, 2 of those knobs you're looking for. So I jumped right on it, and there they were. Buy it now, $5 a piece. Holy mackerel. I must have done something right. So I ordered the 2, I've got them. And what's going to happen is I'm going to take this unit and rebuild it with that new knob on there, because that would make it a lot better. This is the Achilles heel, the tuning of the receiver. But the transmitter is stable as the dickens. It puts out about 8 watts. You put on 40 meters or 80 meters a night and have no trouble working people. If you didn't want to use their receiver, you could use an external receiver. Pretty straightforward though.
Now that is an original one, or is that one that you've put together?
This?
Yes.
Oh, this I built. Yeah, I built it.
Looks factory.
It looks factory?
It looks factory.
I shouldn't. It should look used and old. The cases I steal from our club ancillary building. This is an old wind-up Victrola. Steve, yeah,
Can you use a velvet vernier knob for that same knob?
you could, but you'd have to do some modifications to mount it. And it wouldn't look original. Now, I try to make them as close to original as possible, but there are sometimes you just have to use what you've got. For instance, on the Olga, this is not, if you look at the picture that I passed around, this is not the knob that they used. They had made their own knob. But this is a 4-to-1. This is a 4-to-1 vernier. Came off of a, what did that come off of? BC 375, I think. Anyway, pretty common World War II military. Works great, but it's not the same knob. Well, okay, who's gonna know? Any of you in here jumping up and saying, geez, you've got the wrong knob up there, by golly? No. And it works, that's the key, it works. I mean, why go to the trouble of making something if it isn't gonna work for you? And you worked like the dickens to get your license. Did anybody have somebody just hand you a license? I don't think so. You worked for it, why not use it? You know? And it's amazing how many people are on code at slow speeds for those that, you know, aren't particularly adept at CW. My brother-in-law has got an extra class license, very fine fellow, doesn't know anything about radio. He's got an extra class license, but he memorized the answer to 50 questions. He surprised the devil out of me, because I kept urging him on, signed up for a class that's on the internet. Any of you familiar with it? It's on Skype. There's about 8 or 10 people per class, and apparently they're months.
CWOP organization.
What is it called?
CWOP organization. CW Ops organization.
There you go. So he signed up for the class. Didn't tell me about it. He signed up for the class, and then once he got going on the class, then he called and told me about it. And I said, "Great, that's super, Dave. Guess what? The guy, he sent me a tape of him sending. I said, do you realize how fast you're sending? You know, I said, well, that's about 18 words a minute. It sounds really good, but what can you copy? Yeah, I don't know. I said, well, get on W1AW code practice and see what you do. Well, it turns out he's copied about 7.5 words a minute. But this was a guy who had no interest in CW. None whatsoever. And now, there he is. So if any of you need some help, CW op.
That's it.
I mean, I was blown away by it.
They've got a young man over in Atlanta that passed his code test to the CW op group.
Really?
Copying it over 40 words a minute. That's one of your new young CW operators.
Well, people who tell me that CW is dead, you know, it's not dead. You go on at night and listen to the QRM, for God's sake. You know there's stations there.
To get a security clearance now, if you go through radio school,
Uh-huh.
you have to be able to copy CW.
Really?
It started 3 years ago.
I heard that the military was back teaching CW.
Corey Field, Pensacola, Florida.
How about that?
Can't get out without being able to copy at least 25 words a minute.
What?
Coded? No. 20 words a minute. Coded, 30 words a minute, plain English.
Wow.
To get a security
When you say coded, you're talking about 5-letter groups?
5-letter group.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, my time is up. I've enjoyed this. I've got distracted. I'm sorry. I apologize. I went all over the joint. Any of those of you who have any questions later, I'll be downstairs. I'll be glad to answer anything I can. It's a fascinating subject. I feel a real kinship to the British of what they went through during the war. And I'm just so amazed that they survived in spite of themselves. I mean, it's amazing to me that the struggles they went through and the SOE to me is the ideal way to try to explain to somebody what was going on then. Thanks so much.